The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the plane, she could feel the weight of the day lifting off her shoulders. It had been one of those days in Washington, the kind that drained you, mentally and physically. Briefings, calls, endless media questions. It was a never-ending circus. But now, she was heading home. A short flight, just a few hours of peace, away from the chaotic world of politics. She didn't mind the constant travel. She was used to it. As the youngest press secretary in White House history, it came with the territory. But tonight felt different. It wasn't just about another business trip, another press meeting, another round of politics. Tonight, it was about something else. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She adjusted the strap on her carry-on, weaving through the packed cabin. The plane was nearly full, but she didn't mind. She'd been on flights like this before. What stood out tonight, though, was a sense of unease in the air, a tension she couldn't shake. And then, as she reached her seat in the first-class cabin, she saw him. An elderly man, walking slowly down the aisle, his eyes scanning the seats. His clothes were worn, his movements deliberate. He wore a faded cap that read, World War II veteran. She noticed the small things, the way his hands gripped the seats for support, the way the passengers around him barely seemed to notice. But she saw him. She couldn't ignore him. What happened next was a choice, a simple act of kindness that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Karoline, without a second thought, did something that would alter her flight, her future, and everything she thought she knew. She stood up and offered him her seat. But she didn't know that this simple, kind gesture would take her on a path she could never have imagined. She didn't know that the man she had just given up her seat for wasn't just any veteran. No, he was someone much more dangerous. And now, she was about to find herself caught in a web of secrets and conspiracies bigger than anything she'd ever imagined. The question was no longer, what had she done? It was, what had she just walked into? Karoline's eyes caught sight of him as he slowly made his way down the narrow aisle. The man was in his late 80s, his movements deliberate and careful. His frame was frail, almost fragile, wrapped in a worn-out jacket. On his head sat a cap that read World War II veteran, a cap that had clearly seen better days. It wasn't the kind of hat you bought off the shelf. It was a symbol, a reminder of a time long past, and the sacrifices made during a brutal war. The man's face was lined with age, and there was a quiet dignity in his every step, but it was clear that every movement was a struggle. The passengers around him barely took notice. Some were too engrossed in their phones, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eager to get the boarding process over with. No one paid attention to the elderly man who, with each step, seemed to carry the weight of decades on his shoulders. But Karoline did. She couldn't help but watch him. She felt a pull, a deep sense of sympathy. There was something about the way he moved, about the way his hand gripped the seat backs for support, that made her heart ache. As he drew closer, she saw it more clearly. The exhaustion in his eyes, not just the physical kind, but something deeper. This man had lived through battles, both foreign and domestic. He had fought wars, witnessed horrors, and now he was just trying to make his way to a seat on a plane. The quiet resilience in him stirred something in her. Karoline had always been a fighter too, but this man, he had fought for more than just a career or a place in the world. He had fought for a nation. She felt a twinge of sadness as she watched him. The weight of his years seemed so much heavier now, and the world around him moved on as if his service, his sacrifices, didn't matter. She thought about her own job, her own battles in the press room, and how, sometimes, it all felt so trivial. Here was a man who had lived through history, and yet, people barely noticed him. That wasn't right. It didn't sit well with her. Without thinking, Karoline stood up. She stepped into the aisle, gently blocking the veteran's path. She couldn't stand by and watch him struggle anymore. "Sir," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I'd be honored if you'd take my seat up here in first class." She smiled at him, hoping he would understand. The veteran stopped, his eyes meeting hers, a bit startled by the sudden attention. He seemed to hesitate, looking at the empty seat in first class, then back at her. "Oh, no," he muttered, shaking his head. I couldn't possibly. I'm fine back here. His voice was gentle, but there was a stubbornness in it too, the kind that came with years of independence. Karoline's smile didn't fade. You've already done so much for this country, she said, her tone kind yet insistent. Let me do this for you. She stepped aside slightly, giving him space to make the choice. Just then, the flight attendant arrived, overhearing the exchange. That's very kind of you, Miss Leavitt, she said, her voice warm. The attendant smiled at the veteran and nodded toward the first-class cabin. I can help you to your seat, sir. The veteran seemed to soften, a small chuckle escaping his lips. Well, if you insist, he said, finally conceding, though there was still a glimmer of hesitation in his eyes. But only if you let me buy you a coffee when we land. His words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much, and yet still held on to the small joys of life. As the flight attendant helped him into the first-class seat, Karoline returned to her place in economy. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, the curious glances following her every move. But she didn't do it for attention. She didn't do it to be noticed. She did it because it felt right. Something inside her told her that offering this simple kindness was the least she could do. As she slid into her seat, wedged between two strangers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this small act would lead to something much bigger. She didn't know how, but she had the sense that the moment she had just created, helping an elderly veteran, was about to turn into something far beyond her expectations. The man in seat 24A leaned in slightly, his eyes flicking around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. His voice dropped to a whisper, though the low hum of the plane's engine made it hard to hear. You know who that is, don't you? He asked, his words barely above a murmur. Karoline turned toward him, slightly taken aback by the question. She had been lost in her own thoughts, but the man's voice had a certain urgency to it. She shook her head, not sure if she was ready for whatever he was about to say. That man, the man continued, nodding subtly toward the front of the plane. That's Joseph Monroe. The name meant nothing to her. She wasn't sure if she should have known it, but it didn't ring any bells. But the way the man said it made her stomach tighten. It was as though she should know this name, as if it carried weight far beyond the flight they were on. Joseph Monroe. Karoline repeated, raising an eyebrow. Who is he? The man leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as if to gauge her reaction. His voice lowered even more, as if he was sharing a secret. He's a World War II paratrooper, the man said, glancing over at the elderly veteran now settled comfortably in first class. Fought in the 82nd Airborne. But it's not just that. He paused, his gaze flicking to the veteran's cap before turning back to Karoline. He's not just some old man sitting on a plane. He's got a past. A past you wouldn't believe. Karoline's mind raced. She had never heard of him. A paratrooper, yes. But there was something about the man's tone that made her pause. What do you mean? She asked, genuinely curious, though a small voice inside her told her this wasn't going to be a simple story. The man's eyes darted around again, lowering his voice even further, just above a whisper. The CIA, he said, drawing the words out slowly. Black Ops. The kind of missions they don't talk about. The kind that never made it into the history books. Karoline felt a shiver run down her spine. She had heard of secretive government operations. Of course. Everyone had. But to hear this man speak so casually about it made her uneasy. There's more, the man continued, his eyes glinting with something Karoline couldn't quite read. Monroe disappeared in the 70s. Just vanished. No one knows where he went. Some think he was involved in something big, something the government doesn't want anyone to know about. And others? Well, they think he just got too close to something he shouldn't have. Karoline's mind raced. Could this be true? The man seemed serious, but there was something about him that made Karoline feel skeptical. She had spent enough time in politics to know how easily people could twist the truth into something far more dramatic than it really was. The way he spoke, with such certainty, made her wonder if he had his own agenda. Her thoughts were interrupted as she looked back at the veteran. Joseph Monroe was now sitting in the first-class seat, adjusting his armrest slowly. He seemed calm, almost serene, as if the chaos of the world didn't touch him. His eyes met Karoline's for a brief moment, and something about his gaze made her heart skip a beat. It wasn't just a glance. It was a knowing look, one that seemed to weigh her, like he understood more about her than she could have possibly imagined. Karoline felt a sudden unease. She couldn't explain why, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. The man in 24A had just told her things that seemed too far-fetched to believe, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much deeper going on here. She watched Monroe carefully, trying to make sense of the pieces in her mind. Was this really the same man who had fought in World War II? Was he truly involved in secretive government operations? The weight of the man's story, coupled with Monroe's penetrating gaze, made Karoline feel like she was being drawn into something she wasn't prepared for. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to focus on the present moment. But it was hard to ignore the growing sense that she had just witnessed the first clue of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. The man in 24A, sensing her discomfort, smiled slightly, as though he knew he had planted a seed of doubt. Karoline's mind buzzed, her thoughts racing. Was she just being paranoid? Was this simply a flight filled with strange coincidences? Or was there really something more to the story of Joseph Monroe? Her gaze returned to the old man in first class. He had settled into his seat now, leaning back slightly, his eyes closed. He looked like a man who had seen too much. A man who had lived through battles, both on the field and in his own life. Karoline couldn't help but wonder what secrets he carried, and what role he might play in this story that was just beginning to unfold. The captain's voice came over the intercom, sharp and precise, breaking through the low murmur of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing an unexpected systems check from air traffic control. There's no cause for concern, but we'll be in a holding pattern for the next 20 minutes. Flight attendants, please remain in position." Karoline's eyes flicked up from her seat as the announcement echoed in the cabin. Unexpected systems check? She had flown enough to know that these checks weren't uncommon, but something about the way the captain said it didn't sit well with her. The words felt rehearsed, like they were trying to downplay something that wasn't as simple as they made it sound. A faint unease crept into her chest. The man in 24A, the one who had shared the strange story about Joseph Monroe, let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's suspicious," he muttered to himself, loud enough for Karoline to hear. "That kind of check doesn't happen at this altitude." She glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. The way he said it didn't seem like a random comment. It was as if he knew more about these procedures than he should. Karoline shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. The whole situation felt off. Her eyes scanned the cabin, watching passengers glance nervously at each other. Some looked toward the flight attendants, who were standing quietly, trying to remain calm. Others, like the man in 24A, were clearly aware that something wasn't quite right. The longer she thought about it, the more unsettled Karoline became. The delay wasn't just unusual, it was entirely unnecessary. The plane was cruising at a steady altitude, the skies were clear, and there was no sign of weather disruptions. So why was this happening? Why were they now in a holding pattern? Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, eyes flicking nervously toward the flight attendants who remained oddly still, as though waiting for instructions. Karoline noticed the tightness in their faces, the subtle tension in their shoulders. There was a quiet sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something. But what? She leaned back slightly, trying to relax, but it was hard to ignore the growing feeling in her chest. Something wasn't right. She tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing. But then, as she glanced toward first class, she caught sight of Monroe. He was still seated in his place, looking perfectly composed, his hands resting gently on the armrests. His face was expressionless, but his eyes, those eyes, were sharp, alert. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, but his gaze seemed to scan the entire cabin. Monroe was the only one who seemed unaffected by the sudden tension in the air. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't reacting. It was as if he had seen it all before, and this was just another day for him. The plane shifted slightly, a small turbulence that rattled the overhead bins. Karoline's heart jumped in her chest. The flight attendants didn't move, and passengers held their breath. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a ripple of discomfort through the cabin. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the air felt heavier. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Karoline's skin prickled with anxiety. Suddenly, two men appeared at the front of the cabin. They walked with purpose, their faces blank and unreadable. They were dressed in dark suits, their movements sharp and precise. Their eyes scanned the passengers as they made their way toward the back of the plane. Karoline's stomach tightened. These men weren't flight attendants. They didn't belong here. One of the men stopped by the galley, his gaze sweeping across the cabin. The other continued toward Karoline's row. He didn't look at anyone else, just straight ahead. His eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her shift in her seat. He stopped just short of her and leaned in slightly. "Miss Leavitt," the man said, his voice low and controlled. "We need you to come with us." Karoline's pulse quickened, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Whispers spread through the rows as passengers began to notice what was happening. No one spoke, but Karoline could feel their eyes on her, curiosity and concern written on their faces. The man didn't wait for her response. He just stood there, waiting. Her mind raced. What could they want with her? Why now? She looked over toward the flight attendants, who were watching carefully but didn't intervene. They looked as if they were waiting for something. A few passengers looked toward her, then quickly looked away, clearly uncomfortable with what was unfolding. "Miss Leavitt," the man repeated, his voice firmer now. "Please, come with us." Before she could process it, Monroe's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Don't go with them," he said, his tone low but urgent. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to fade. His expression was hard to read, but the intensity in his gaze sent a jolt of electricity through Karoline. Karoline hesitated. The man in 24A had warned her about Monroe's mysterious past, about the dangers surrounding him. But this wasn't about him. This was about her. She felt a rush of panic, a need to understand what was happening, what was going on. But her instincts told her to move, to follow the men and see where this led. She stood slowly, her legs feeling like lead. The man from 24A didn't take his eyes off her, but he said nothing more. Karoline shot him a glance, then nodded, half apologetically, to the veteran in first class. Monroe watched her, his gaze unreadable. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but the need for answers was stronger than the warning in Monroe's eyes. As she followed the men down the aisle, a strange sense of finality settled over her. She didn't know what was about to happen, but whatever it was too late to turn back now. The two men led Karoline toward the front of the plane, their steps quick and purposeful. She felt a mix of confusion and curiosity swirling inside her as they approached the galley area. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step she took. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she had a sense that things were about to take a turn she wasn't prepared for. The men finally stopped, standing close to the crew's jump seats. One of them, a tall figure with a cold demeanor, turned to her. His eyes locked onto hers, and he spoke with a voice that carried an air of authority. "Miss Leavitt, we need to ask you about Joseph Monroe." Karoline blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in focus. "Monroe?" she repeated. "What do you mean? I don't understand." The agent's gaze didn't waver. "He's carrying something dangerous. We believe he has classified material with him, documents that could compromise national security." Karoline's mind raced. "Documents?" She shook her head. "I don't know anything about any documents. I just gave him my seat. He's just an old man. What are you talking about?" The agent exchanged a brief look with his colleague before he spoke again, this time more firmly. "It's not just any old man, Miss Leavitt. This man has a history, one that involves highly classified government operations. What he's carrying could expose things that are meant to stay buried." Karoline's stomach tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. He's a veteran. I gave him my seat because it felt like the right thing to do. That's it. The agent didn't look convinced. You need to understand, Miss Leavitt. This is much bigger than you think. Joseph Monroe's involvement in these operations runs deep. The material he has could trigger an international incident. We need to get it from him. Her mind was spinning now. She could hardly believe what they were saying. The idea that she was somehow involved in something so much larger than herself was overwhelming. I don't have anything to do with this, she insisted, her voice shaking. I just offered him a seat. Before the agent could respond, the plane jerked sharply, a violent shift that made Karoline grab onto the nearest seat to steady herself. The sudden movement threw the cabin into chaos, and a few gasps echoed from the passengers. The overhead bins rattled, and Karoline could hear the sounds of shifting bodies as everyone braced themselves. The agent's expression didn't change, though his eyes flicked to the flight attendants, who were now standing by with tense faces. "Captain, this is not good," one of the agents muttered under his breath. The intercom crackled to life, the captain's strained voice cutting through the unease in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence at the moment. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will keep you informed as soon as we have more details." Karoline's heart raced. That wasn't just turbulence. This was different. The way the captain spoke, the edge in his voice, it wasn't routine. It was something more. She felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on her chest. She had no idea what was going on, but everything was suddenly spiraling out of control. The plane jolted again, this time even harder, as though it was being pulled by an unseen force. Passengers began to panic, murmuring, gripping their seatbacks, and glancing nervously at each other. Some tried to peek into the cockpit area, but no one was moving. Karoline's mind went back to Monroe, still sitting quietly in first class, completely unaffected by the chaos around him. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening. His face remained calm, as if the turbulence didn't faze him in the slightest. Karoline's unease grew. This was no ordinary flight, and it wasn't just about the documents anymore. She had a horrible feeling that whatever was happening was linked to him. Monroe's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't trust them." Her eyes flicked toward the bag at her feet. The agents had been so focused on their questions that they hadn't even noticed it. Monroe's bag. She reached down, her hand trembling slightly as she grabbed it. The weight of it felt heavier than she remembered, and her stomach knotted. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside it was the key to everything that was happening. She unzipped the bag carefully, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Inside, she felt a few layers of clothing, but there was something more, something firm and heavy underneath. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of an envelope, sealed tightly with the unmistakable insignia of the US government. The sight of it made her blood run cold. She pulled it out cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. This was no ordinary letter. Alongside the envelope, she felt something smaller and metallic. A flash drive. Her fingers went numb as she held it in her hand. This wasn't just any piece of tech. It was clearly something important, something that could reveal information that was never meant to see the light of day. Her breath caught in her throat. The agents had been right. Monroe had been carrying classified material, but now she had it in her hands. And in that moment, Karoline understood what was happening. Monroe hadn't just given her his seat out of kindness. He had chosen her for a reason. But why? And what exactly was on this flash drive? The turbulence hit again, and the cabin groaned under the strain. Karoline looked around, her pulse quickening. The agents were still watching her, but now there was something else. A sense of urgency in their eyes. They knew she had found it. They knew what she had. The real danger was just beginning, and whatever Monroe had passed to her, it was worth more than anyone could have imagined. The agent from 24A approached Karoline once more, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. His demeanor was colder now, more forceful. He knew she had the documents. He had to. There was no other reason for her to have been pulled from her seat and taken to the front of the plane. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice clipped, "you have them, don't you?" His eyes searched her face, watching for any sign of hesitation, any clue that would confirm his suspicion. Karoline swallowed, feeling the weight of the bag beneath her feet. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her voice steady. She glanced at the agent's partner, who stood a few feet behind him, observing her quietly. The agent's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. We know what's in that bag. Now, hand it over." The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. Karoline knew she had to be careful. Any wrong move could send this situation spiraling out of control. She wasn't about to give them what they wanted. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what was going on. She glanced toward first class, her eyes briefly meeting Monroe's. He was still calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. It only made her more certain. He knew more than he had let on, and he had picked her for a reason. She had no intention of trusting these men, not when they weren't being honest with her. "I don't have anything," she repeated, her voice now quieter, more insistent. She tried to play the game, to throw them off. Her gamble was to cooperate just enough to stay in control. She had to act like she was compliant, make them believe she was following their orders. "Come with us, then," the agent said, his voice sharp. "We'll make this easy for you." Karoline's mind raced. She could feel the heavy pressure of the bag, and she knew that the documents inside it were more dangerous than anyone realized. But she couldn't let them know she had it. Not yet. Not until she was ready to face whatever truth was waiting. The plane suddenly lurched again, sending a jolt through the cabin. The passengers gasped, gripping their seats. The overhead bins rattled once more, and Karoline was forced to hold onto the nearest seat for balance. The turbulence was different this time. It wasn't just a shake. It was violent, unsettling, and it made her stomach drop. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through, but this time there was something off about his tone. It was strained, tight with fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing an issue with the plane. Please stay calm. We will keep you informed." Karoline's blood ran cold. She had heard enough. This wasn't normal turbulence. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Her heart hammered in her chest. The plane was in danger. But why? Was it because of the documents she was hiding? Was that the real reason the agents were after her? The agent's eyes flicked toward the cockpit, his face tense. He said nothing, but Karoline could tell something had shifted. The plane wasn't just in the air. It was spiraling into something much more sinister. Karoline couldn't stay here anymore. She couldn't let these men control her, couldn't let them take her into their grasp. She had the documents now. She had the truth. Monroe had trusted her with it. She had to keep it hidden, even if it meant risking everything. As the agent turned to speak to his partner, Karoline seized her chance. Without warning, she grabbed the bag and pushed it under her seat. The agent glanced back at her, but he said nothing. The situation wasn't resolved yet, but it was clear that the stakes had risen. She had something they wanted, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. She had no idea what was coming next. She didn't know where this plane was headed, but one thing was certain. The truth she now held was powerful and deadly. It was worth fighting for, and she couldn't let anyone take it from her. Looking out the window, Karoline took a deep breath. She had made her choice. She was in this now, no matter what came next. Some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried, and some truths are worth fighting for, no matter the cost.